Do you want to get into programming specifically to make games in Godot? First, you'll need to know the basics of how to type code. So this is my day 0 programming video for Godot using C#. Programming is made up of 3 main constructs: sequence, selection, and iteration. So let's get started. So sequence. Imagine you're following a recipe and follow the steps in order. That's what sequence is. So in this example, we run the first line first, the second line second, third line third, and fourth line fourth. So we run that in sequence. And you can see I'm printing each line individually, and if I look inside my console in Godot, I have the result. That's what the programming construct sequence means. Running lines of code one after another in sequence. In C#, to call a Godot built-in function, we use gd.functionName. So all we need to know for now is gd.print prints that line within the console. In C#, we end each line of code with a semicolon. So you see every single line I have ends in a semicolon. Use indenting to make your code blocks clearer. However, unlike other languages, indenting is not required. So what does this mean? You see, these are functionally the same. I've put 2 statements on the same line, and this performs perfectly fine. So we should use indenting to make sure our code is clear. Boilerplate. So the boring bit of programming is making sure you have the boilerplate code to tell the compiler what to do. In other words, you have a bunch of lines of code which you have to have there, even though they're not very exciting. So this is the code we looked at earlier. So first of all, we need to tell Godot, how often do we run this code? Do we run it once? Do we run it every frame? Do we run it only twice? We need to tell Godot how many times to run it. We also need to tell Godot when to run it. So do we run it at the start of the game, at the end, halfway between? So we have a function which tells us that. So in the ready function in Godot, so that just tells us that Godot will run this code as soon as this node enters the scene tree. In other words, as soon as the object is ready to run it. However, that's not all the code that we have. We also need to have all of this code around it. So this is basically saying these are the libraries that we have to reference, and all of this is within a class. For now, you don't need to know what all of this does. All you need to know is that we need this for our code to run. Variable. A variable, in simple terms, is just a storage location of data that we can reference using a variable name. C# is what we call strongly typed. So every single variable we create has a specific type assigned to it. So to declare a variable in C#, we first put the type at the start, then we put the name of the variable, equals, and then the value we want to assign to it. So you see here, where we declare the variable matters. If we create a variable outside any functions, then this variable will be accessible to any function within this script. If we assign it within a function, then it's only accessible within that function. Outside of that function, you cannot reference this variable. Won't go into too much detail in this video, but a public string, any other class can reference this variable, and a private variable, then only this class can reference it. If we don't put public or private, it just assumes it's private. Selection, that's the next programming construct. It's the fancy word for making a choice. So, we create a variable of a number, and then in our ready function, we're first checking if the variable is less than or equal to 10, do one set of code. Otherwise, else if the number is bigger than or equal to 100, then we do this set of code. Otherwise, if both of those are not true, then we run this code. C# uses if condition, and then some squiggly brackets with all the code that needs to run if that condition is true. It uses else if for else if statements, and uses else as squiggly brackets for else statements. You cannot have else if or else statements if you don't already have an if statement there. We can also use switch statements instead. So we have our variable here, which is a number. We check against this variable here, and we say if it's 0, then we run this code. If it's 1, we run this code. Otherwise, if we haven't declared a particular case for it, then we run this code. We use the term break to exit the switch statement. So at the end of each case, we put break. This is way more advanced and isn't really in the scope of this video, but you can also do internal variables here to check against a bunch of maths. Obviously in this case you wouldn't do 1 plus 3 minus 4 because that's dumb, but if you had to do more complex maths, this is how you would do it. You can also have ternary operators. This basically means instead of having to do an if-else statement, we can do it entirely in line. So we have our condition here, so is the number equal to 0? If it is 0, then we want to mark this variable as true, otherwise if it isn't 0, we want to mark it as false. So variable equals condition, question mark, and then we want to put the result if true, colon, and the result if false. And then obviously our semicolon at the end. Iteration is the fancy term for a loop. So there's a bunch of different types of loops. For instance, here we have a for statement. We're generating an internal variable called I. I starts off at 0, I is less than 10, and this is what we increment I by each time. So plus plus is saying increase it by 1. Note this will print the numbers 0 to 9. This is because we're saying I needs to be less than 10, not less than or equal to 10. Another type is a while loop. So here, while this condition is true, we run all this code. The only limitation of a while loop is you need to make sure that it has an exit. Here it says if it's less than 10, then this will keep running, and I've made sure to increment I. If the condition was always set to true, then your game would crash. So while the condition is true, run this code. We also have a do while loop. So a do while loop is exactly the same, but we check the while condition at the end. This means that if this condition is false, this code will still run once. This is because we check the condition at the end. So these two are pretty much the same, but if this condition is false, this while loop would never run, while this do while loop would run once only. And finally, we have a for each. So if we have some form of list or array, for each variable type, local variable in our list or array, then do stuff with it. We can use the term break to exit the loop immediately and skip the rest of the iterations. We can also use the term continue to cut off the current iteration and proceed to the next one. So here you see I'm going through each element in the array, print the value, and if the element is equal to 4, then we stop the entire loop. Our array here, we're doing 1, 4, and then it gets to 4 and it goes, oh, the element matches 4, and we stop the loop there. So we only find it do 1, 4. We can also use continue for each element in the array. If the element is equal to 4, so anything past this continue is ignored, and then we continue on. However, if it isn't equal to 4, then we print out the element. So you see here, so in this array, 1, we skip 4, 2, 7, 8. So you see, we skip number 4 there. Procedures / functions. So a procedure is a set of code that you run, and you can call this from anywhere, and a function will always return a value. So they're pretty much the same thing, procedures and functions, and you'll see a lot of tutorials actually say the wrong thing. A function always returns a value, a procedure doesn't return a value. So here we have a function. So we say we want to return the type of a boolean, we put the name of it, we do the stuff, and then return the value that we want. After the function name, we have these brackets, and then we have our curly brackets here to denote the code that's within. If we instead want to have it as a procedure, then we instead just do void, which basically just means it doesn't return anything. We put the name of it, and then we do our stuff, and we don't have to return a value within that. So if we want our function to take some data, then we do, within our brackets, we put the data type and the parameter name. So here we're doing, if the parameter is set to one thing, we return true, otherwise we return false. Remember, a function has to return a value. We can call our function from anywhere. So we call function 1, and we set parameter to this string, checks it, returns the value we want, and then this variable is set to that function result. So functions must return a value of the declared type. Procedures don't return any value and instead use void. Parameters can be declared within a type and a name. Multiple parameters can be given to a function or procedure separated with a comma. So that is day 0 of programming. You've learned how to do sequence, selection, and iteration. You've learned how to create variables, how to create functions and procedures, and how to pass values through to those. That's the entirety of the foundations of programming. With all of this, you can make your first video game. The day 1 video will cover Godot in more detail, how each of these things come together to make a video game. But first, leave any questions in the comments, here are some other tutorials, and I'll see you in the next one.